the developed Western countries have suffered many terrorist attacks that have had a negative effect on their economy, their society, and their safety, which have also provoked a hard impact on tourism, making flocks of tourists avoid destinations which have become dangerous or unsafe, or in which there is high risk of suffering an attack. First of all, we should know what terrorism is and what is considered as it. Looking for a general definition, there is not any universal agreement on it indeed. However, the United Nations have condemned terrorist attacks, stating that they are criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public for political purposes, which in any circumstance are unjustifiable, wherever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. Furthermore, an agency such as the FBI classifies terrorism into international and domestic. The international terrorism is inspired by or associated with designed foreign terrorist organizations or nations, whereas the domestic terrorism seeks to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences. We will later focus on each one of these cases.
Let's talk now about the different kinds of terrorism. Okay, so first of all, we should know that there are five main kinds of terrorism according to the purpose of the attacks. The first one is a state-sponsored terrorism, which consists when a government sponsor or execute terrorist attacks among other states. We can put the example of Azerbaijan and Armenia, which is the most recent one. The second kind of terrorism is decent terrorism. This is when a national group of terrorism have a rebellion against the national government. We can put an example of ETA in this case, which philosophy was to destroy the main base of the terrorism. This is something that we're going to talk about later. Third kind of terrorism is political terrorism, which are groups rooted on political ideologies. Doesn't matter if it's left or right-wing ideologies. And so that's it. The fourth is religious terrorism, which are terrorist groups which are extremely religiously motivated. There's not much more to explain that. And finally, the criminal terrorism, which are terrorist acts used to aid in crime and basically.
The anti-terrorist alert level consists in a scale made up of several complementary levels, each of which is associated with a degree of risk, based on the assessment of the terrorist threat that is appreciated at each moment. The classification provided for in the anti-terrorist prevention and protection plane has 5 action levels associated with a certain level of risk. Level 1 corresponds to low risk, Level 2 to moderate risk, Level 3 to medium risk, Level 4 high risk, and Level 5 very high risk. In relation to tourism, the higher level of risk is the less tourists will be attracted in the affected area because people will not trust that area because of the fact that there is a risk that could take place another attack imminently.
At the time to remark the main terrorist groups which have damaged tourism, which means a big source of income for Western countries, we should talk about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because they are the ones that have acted the most in those Western countries, which are the main terrorism focus around the world. Those groups are nationalist movements that have the purpose to destroy Western culture and values through imposing the fear to the citizens.
The September 11th attack is the single deadliest terrorist attack in history, resulting in 2,977 fatalities and over 25,000 injuries and at least $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage. It took place the morning of September 11th, 2001, when 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 different airplanes willing to crash them into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and the Capitol building. The latter ended up crashing on a field in Pennsylvania, but the rest did succeed, prompting not only those buildings to collapse, but the whole world economy, due to the massive effect of it and the United States economy influence worldwide. Regarding the economy, the world and especially the United States markets were seriously affected because of the fact that the Wall Street stock market did not open until September 17th, when Dow Jones values dropped 7.1% and by the end of that week had fallen 14.3%. In addition, as a consequence of the destruction of businesses, 143,000 jobs and $2.8 million wages were lost in the first 3 months. Consequently, as we can see in this graphic, after a strong 2000 but a weak 2001 in economic growth in terms of GDP, the US economy was set in negative numbers, and the third quarter of 2001 and New York City's economy plummeted up to 15%. This also affected the financial system of the government, making 2001 have negative total budget deficit and the national debt to increase for more than $200 billion the next year. As far as the impacts of tourism are concerned, the attacks already had a negative impact on this sector in the short term because North American airspace was closed for several days, and henceforth, as it is observed in this graphic, air travel decreased in the same 2001 and in 2002, causing financial issues to grow and in the airline industry, especially in the US. This meant that passengers' international air traffic was very affected, which also caused awful consequences for hotels and distribution networks. In addition, as the New York City airport's arrivals are shown in this other graphic, it is seen they dropped in more than 2 million visitors, which were not recovered in the next year. However, after studies on tourism flows after 9/11, it was found that American tourists changed their travel plans instead of canceling them, giving priority to domestic destinations they perceived as less risky. As a result, Hawaii, despite a significant drop in international visitors, had a robust growth in tourism coming from the mainland United States. Going even further, studies also report that destinations located in the Mediterranean area, such as the Belgrades, were not as much affected in terms of tourism as others with high proportion of Islamic population like Tunisia or Turkey.
The revolutions and protests in the Arab world from 2010 to 2012, known by different means as the Arab Democratic Revolution or the Arab Spring, consist of a series of popular uprisings qualified as repression in the Arab countries, mainly in northern Africa. This movement started in Tunisia and continued in countries such as Egypt and Yemen. The Arab Spring meant the total loss of tourists in these areas and the start of civil wars. This has directly affected countries with a large flow of tourists, such as Egypt and Tunisia, because the Arab Spring caused political instability that caused a complete decrease in tourism due to the country's situation. This graph shows us the evolution of the arrival of tourists in Egypt and Tunisia from 2010 to 2015. We can see how the number of tourists drops almost 5 million in the case of Egypt and 2.5 million in the case of Tunisia, and this is due to the effects produced by the Arab Spring explained previously. In this other graph, we can see how GDP declines in these countries during the years of the Arab Spring, and this includes the drop in tourism, of course. On the one hand, Yemen is the country that reaches the lowest peak, but in the following years the GDP increases and returns to the previous state. On the other hand, Egypt has a lower GDP drop, but this value does not see an increase.
Okay, so now let's talk about how the terrorism has effect to the southeast of Asia. I'm going to talk about two main cases, which are Bali in Indonesia and Thailand. In the case of Bali, we're going to talk about the main attack, which was in 12 October of 2002. That was the deadliest attack ever in Indonesia. That was executed by the terrorist group Jemaah Islamiyah. 202 people were dead there. From those, 164 were tourists. The targets of that attack were two nightclubs whose clients were mostly from Western and the USA's consulate. The main consequences of that attack was the loss of big loss of tourism, amount of 31% of the tourists it did take actually 4 years to recover the incomes from tourism. Indonesia, as we said in the economic context, has tourism as an economic base and lost a considerable source of incomes, which meant an deceleration of the economic growth of the country, obviously. So that was a disaster in Indonesia at that moment when you lose your main base of the economy in such a short term. The concrete area of Bali, only Bali, lost more than 100,000 of tourists from January of 2002 to January 2003. And it took around 3 years to reach the maximum from 2001 of that amount of tourists. So as we can see, the Bali attacks of 2002 also had a considerable effect in the number of tourists which visited the Asian continent. So it took around 1 year to recover the number of foreign visitors to Asia, as we can see in the second graph. The second most affected area in the southeast of Asia was Thailand. So before to explain anything, let's put a bit in context the current situation in the country. Well, the most of the population is Buddhist, and Buddhists are accused to discriminate and oppress the minority of the Muslim population according to the Muslims' version. It has caused a rebellion against the government, divided in many focus. This conflict has existed since the beginning of the century, and during these 20 years has made the loss of 11.3 million of tourists, according to the official sources. Unfortunately, it has not been any big terrorist attack in Thailand, but there have been many of them during the century, which has not caused more than 4 or 5 deaths each one. For example, we can remark the 2005 terrorist attack in Bangkok, if I'm not wrong, which just caused 5 deaths. 5 deaths. So we cannot talk about so critical situation in Thailand as we can do, for example, in Bali.
Along the latest years, our country has suffered many terrorist attacks from several organizations with different aims and purposes, going from ETA to Al Qaeda or ISIS. They all took place in the main Spanish cities, and therefore they have a great impact on many sectors, especially on tourism. From the 1950s until the 2000s, the Basque nationalist group ETA carried out several important attacks in order to push their independentist ideals. The most critical bombings they have done are Prime Minister Carrero Blanco's assassination and the Hypercore attack in Barcelona, in which 21 people died. ETA, whose purpose was to conditionate the tourism, one of the main sources of the Spanish GMT, hadn't had such a big incidence in Spain. Its philosophy was mainly based on 2 points. The first one was the perception of tourists as representatives of capitalist and oppressor states, from which Spain depends from. The second one was the choice of target. They didn't pretend to attack any local citizen from Euskadi, because the target of the organization was to execute pressure at the center government to reach independence from it, so they couldn't get sympathy from the local population by killing them. The forecast of the losses of tourism caused directly by ETA is around 14,000 people.
Since the decline of ETA, Islamist terrorism warning has been increasing and increasing and increasing. There have been taking place 2 important attacks in Spain, the 2004 Madrid train bombings and 2017 Barcelona and Cambril attacks. The first one took place at Atocha station on March 11 of 2004, where the Zirconian train system was bombed and 191 people passed away and 2,000 were injured. The attack was led by an Al-Qaeda terrorist cell and meant the deadliest terrorist attack in the Spanish history, with a 5.3 million cost in material damage. Nonetheless, it actually didn't have any impact on the touristic sector due to the influence of Madrid as a capital city in businesses. So unfortunately, the tourism didn't have such a big impact. By other hand, we're going to talk about Barcelona and Cambridge attacks. They took place on August 17 of 2017, in which 16 people died and 152 were injured. The attack consisted in driving a van into pedestrians in the middle of La Rambla in Barcelona, and the same with a car in Cambrils, where there was another fatal victim and all 6 injured. Despite those terrorist attacks, the number of tourists in Barcelona wasn't affected at all. I mean, it was incredible. In fact, the amount of visitors to the capital of Catalonia had an increase of 3.2%. And wait, this is even more surprising knowing the big tension caused by the independence referendum on 1st of October. So even having all these critical situations in a political way, in a terrorist way, etc., it has an increase of the tourism, which is amazing for me. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution of number of passengers in the El Prat airport. In this graph, we can see the evolution between 2015 and 2017. 2017 is represented by the red bars, and 2015 and 2016 are represented in those 2 lines. So we can see quite a big improvement, quite good increase of number of passengers during all the year, especially in the summer months, in respect to the past years. So we can take it as a conclusion that terrorism in itself has not affected at all the touristic industry in Barcelona.